Welcome to Framework Leadership, a podcast about principles and ideas you can use today to take your leadership to the next level. Exclusively now on SCU Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kent Ingle, president of Southeastern University, and I'm excited to introduce our co-host for today's show, SCU Chief of Staff, Michael Steiner. You are my boss, Chief of Staff.
Well, it's a mutual boss situation, so I make sure you make it from point A to point B.
Yes. And congratulations, Dr. Michael Steiner.
Thank you.
You just completed your PhD. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about that PhD.
Yes. I completed a doctorate of philosophy in business psychology. So it's a massive mouthful. Really simply, I just love the way people think together. And so, the long story short is I started my undergrad theology. I did my master's in business. So you've got super soft people skills, then you've got a super hard organizational skill. So I was like, what is the one thing that I can kind of use to combine the two? And that's business psychology. So it's the soft skills of making an organization run well, be healthy. And it's so much fun. I mean, there's just so much out there in that field. It really is kind of org leadership is a subsection of it. HR is a subsection of it. There's just like a lot of really cool stuff. I'm excited to unpack some of that stuff. I think in today's conversation, I think it'd be really cool.
And your education is just absolutely vital to what we do here at Southeastern in terms of our organizational structure, our framework, leadership process, and you are definitely a great gift to our team.
And what's crazy is how much. So obviously I've been here since I was an undergrad student. When my second year was your first year as a president. So I've heard framework leadership. I've eaten, breathed it. I understand it every way. And what was bananas to me is as I started my doctoral program and we started getting into theory, how much that idea of framing, reducing everything down to just a couple simple points to give you the right direction, that's the secret sauce to everything. I mean, it's your own personal life, and we've got all the different frameworks, and that's not what today's episode's about. We should do one about it,
yes.
But it's just everywhere. When you can boil it down to a framework, that's the secret right there.
Yeah. Well, today we're going to talk about creating a framework for communication inside of your organization. As leaders, we cannot underestimate the power of healthy, strong communication. Every moment and movement of our organization will always flow through the channels of communications that we create, that we establish. We have to realize that healthy communication is our primary responsibility and begins literally from the top down and from the down, up to the top. And as a leader, you have to be intentional in creating an effective flow of communication throughout your entire organization. As we jump into this conversation, I want to begin by emphasizing the most important aspect of what I believe is effective communication, and that is this whole idea of being a listener, where you are posturing yourself to always listen. In order to have awareness of your organization, you must carefully listen before you speak. And this requires emotional intelligence and the skill of knowing how to read a room, knowing how to read the people. So, Michael, what are some of the things that you are listening for when you work to establish a framework for communication?
Yeah. So, neurologist Evan Gordon, kind of a famous neurologist, but not just the hard science of neurology, also in psychology. He says that all of human behavior can be boiled down to one principle, and that's risk versus reward. And so everything that people do, everything that people think about whenever they're hearing something and experiencing, they are trying to ask two questions. They're asking, how much am I at risk to lose? And then how much can I gain from this situation? So when we talk about a framework for communication, we have to realize that everything I'm saying to somebody, even right now in this podcast, you're evaluating onto, am I going to lose something as a result of this, or am I going to gain something as a result of this? And so when we talk about reading people, there's so often where we think we've got a great idea and all they hear is, I'm going to lose. And this, honestly, this just happened to me a couple weeks ago. I was in a meeting with some of our other colleagues and some of the other VPs in the room, and we were talking about some really cool systems. But before we could innovate, we wanted to understand what was happening. And so part of that is I asked for specific metrics on different things. In my head, it was so that we could make it better, so that we could give more, all that kind of stuff. All they heard was, oh, you want to take something away from me. Oh, and specifically budget. I mean, when you're in an organization, that's where it all goes down to. How much budget do I have? Do I not have so much budget? And so in the middle of that, I'm trying to communicate to actually possibly give them more budget. Yeah. But what they heard was that I'm trying to take budget away from them. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. And it's because everything can be boiled down to that risk versus reward. So that's how you have to evaluate what you're saying to somebody when you're communicating and really what you're looking for in that side.
Yeah. And for me, I can tell you, it involves always being contextually aware. You have to be aware of the effects of both your own and others' emotions, their motives, their body language. They can be saying something, but their expressions are totally different, and you have to kind of recognize that.
And let me say, you've got this weird voodoo power. I've watched it for the last 3 years, where you can and it's so funny. You walk out of a meeting with somebody, and you can list off like what they're going for and what they're thinking, and kind of their underlying motivations, like crazy. Like you've got this weird sense. How did you develop that? You call it discernment, but how do you, as a leader, how did you develop that over your life?
Well, it definitely comes over time. And I think it definitely comes because communication has always been, a passion for me. I mean, that was my undergraduate. It was in communications, and my training and development and work, especially when I started broadcasting, because you're going to be interviewing, you're going to be with people. You have to, and if you want to pull information out, you have to kind of understand them, understand what they're thinking right then. And so it's something that you develop over time. But I do think there is that spiritual element to that. I'll tell you, every day in my life, I pray, God, give me discernment, give me wisdom, help me in every conversation that I have, every relational moment, to be able to sense what's truly going on. And it's always been amazing to me, like you said, I can tend to pick that up pretty quickly and pretty easily. So I just think it takes time, it takes intentionality, it takes prayer, it takes a lot of those things. But it's so important to, again, in my personal mission has always been that 2-word, others oriented, and if you are constantly oriented in understanding that person in the midst of a conversation, you're going to be able to connect and discover and then move forward in whatever, needs to happen in the midst of that, meeting, that situation, conflict, whatever it might be. So, it's always important for me to be on the lookout for any underlying message that someone might be sending, your way. So what are some things that you've used now? I mean, you've, as you said, you've learned, from me a little bit, but what are some things that you've discovered that also help you personally in that process? Yeah.
And what's so funny, I joke about this, but I grew up homeschooled, so I kind of had a little delay in my socialization process up to high school and stuff. So for me, I always start with trying to take people exactly what they're saying. So I start there. And sometimes it's so funny, people get so caught up in what they're subtly trying to communicate that they don't actually think about what they're actually saying.
Right.
And so for me, that's where I start. I just start breaking down. It's like, okay, you're saying this thing. Like the big thing where I see this is when people try and be passive aggressive, right?
Yeah,
where they're
absolutely.
saying like, oh, I don't care about this kind of thing, but really they do care about it.
Right.
Well, I just start treating them as if they don't care about it.
Yeah.
And so what happens is what I've seen is the more and more I try and treat them exactly what they're saying, then they feel the urge to actually start saying what they mean. And so then I get to this point, and what always happens then is the conflict, right? And this is the boiling over point where they said, I've been 3 years trying to communicate to you what I care about. I'm like, well, you never said it.
Right.
You never said it. How can I go past it from that point? So I think part of it, like you said, is time. As you get, as you build it, you kind of understand those kind of things. But then the other part of it is really putting the ball in people's court to say what they mean.
Yeah.
And be a part of that. And that's what really, when you talk about what good authority is, as the leader, you have that right. Like you don't have to try and decipher and break the code of every single person that's out there. You have the right to push them to say, no, we're going to behave in a certain way. I'm not going to get drug into your emotional problems. I'm not going to get drug into your emotional triangulation with this communication. I'm going to go directly to you. I'm going to ask what I think I need to hear. And that's what, we always talk about the biblical resolve of conflict. That's what Matthew says, right? If you've got a problem with somebody, just go to them.
Just go to them.
Just go to them. And so I think if people started there, a lot of the communication issues that they come to would go away from there.
Perception, expectation, all of it changes when you sit down and you communicate face to face and you listen and you learn and you're engaged. And that, that word there, engage. If you're not engaged, you're not going to have healthy communication. There's no doubt about it.
So what are some of the nonverbals you notice when you're engaging with them?
Well, if I'm in a meeting with a group and we're trying to, if I see someone, well, it's the nonverbal.
Right.
Somebody can actually be saying something, but nonverbally, so for example, there are times when I'll notice someone may be communicating, but they're just, going on their phone.
Right.
I like that idea, but so that's a nonverbal cue. They're not really engaged.
Right.
Or they're not really listening. You can just see it in the emotional, the ethos, the eyes, how you sit.
Right.
So if you just sit back, and relaxed, and that's communicating a certain element to that. Right. But if you're leaning in and you're engaged, that tells me you want to work through this. You want to communicate. You want to have an understanding of resolve. So those are kind of some of the non-things that you just kind of pick up that help you in the process. Now, another task of a leader is to fight against what I call communication barriers.
Right.
And encourage input. I've found that the most effective way to do this is through obvious just getting together and do relationship building. You have to establish trust as the key component of that relationship. So what are some of the things that you've done to fight communication barriers within the teams that you lead?
Well, I think there's two main barriers to communication. Everything, it kind of breaks down to this. It's either time or fear. So my biggest communication blunders have always come from the fact I did give myself enough time to communicate right, or I was too scared to really communicate what needed to be communicated. And honestly, working here in this office really stretched me in both of those, because we joke around all the time about our Enneagram types and all that kind of stuff. But as a Type 3 Wing 4, I will tend to not think through things until the last minute that I needed to. And so I remember the first year, working in your office, the biggest blunders I hit was because I didn't give myself enough time to do it right. I didn't give myself enough time to write the right kind of email. I didn't give myself enough time to think through what I actually wanted to talk about and put it down. Now, part of my superpower is I'm great at winging things, but that's where you start communicating things you didn't intend to. You didn't intend to, right? And so with the team, what I've done is really give myself enough time to do it right. And I think as leaders, sometimes we can get caught up in the tyranny of time, right? That we don't give enough time. And I'll talk about that later in our fire round of some application points. But give yourself enough time to do it right. And then the second thing is identifying why I'm scared. So one of the big things you pushed me on early on was that, like, I speak for the office of the president, or I'm part of the office of the president, especially when you give me a task to accomplish. And then there were too many times where I would acquiesce because I was scared of what the other person would think, or how they would think of me, or how they would take it. Would I offend them in that way? And what I really had to learn is that fear, they will not be offended by what I have to say. Right. And what I need to say needs to be said. So that fear is something I got to minimize, kind of suck up and move past to do it for the health and sake of the organization.
And you lean into the role, and you lean into the expectation.
Yep.
And that's important.
So how do you fight communication barriers?
I can tell you, for me, you can fight these barriers through simple and just direct means of communication. I always want to make sure that there is alignment between the message that you're trying to communicate, and the message that actually leaves your mouth in that moment or that context. There may be times when you might need to, follow up to make sure that the other person is absolutely, completely understood what you were trying to communicate. And that's why communication is a constant feedback loop.
Yeah.
What you say to them, you want to make sure that you hear it back. And if you're not hearing that back, that should be a signal to you. Maybe you didn't communicate it right, or you didn't say the right thing. So if there is a discrepancy between the two, this can definitely lead to frustration, for those that you're having the privilege to work with and understand. I think that's important.
And what that speaks to is that good communication is not just what you say, but also the questions you ask.
Right.
And so people don't always think of question asking as communication, but think about how much you communicate with the right question when you pop it in there. So even talking about developing that feedback loop, it's one thing to give somebody a command and then you ask them, all right, what do I need you to do? So many leaders are scared. They're okay with walking in and say, hey, we need to get this done. Yeah. And then they walk out of the room. But how much more powerful is it to go, we need to get this done. All right, what do we need to get done? They repeat back to you. Do you guys have everything you need to succeed? Oh, I don't know. No. Do you understand what the win is? And so those questions help open up and really create this, what we call in the business psychology, self-efficacy. It's you want your people to feel like they can win. It's one thing to give them a task. It's another thing to give them the confidence that they can actually do that task. And so, Kent, you always talk about this idea of communicating out of position. So who you are is also tied into what you are, like your position. And as a leader, this goes back to that intentionality. Right. You have to be cautious with the relationship. And when I think about you, especially as the president of our university, you are probably at the pinnacle of this, where what you say matters so much. And so how do you do that? What is that level of caution? What are the things you're thinking through as you're talking and communicating from your position? Yeah, I mean, words do matter, especially when you are serving in a particular role and you're the leader. What you say carries a lot of weight, as well as how you say it. Yep. And I've always had to be aware that everything I say has direct consequences. There will always be direct consequences. So I have to be intentional about not making promises that I can't deliver. So I have to think through before I make that statement. Yep. Or am I saying something that I might not be able to deliver? I have to take care to not make a statement that carries unintentional weight. Yep. And as we move into the fire round, I do want to direct our focus, because this is so important, on the application of these kinds of things. Yep. Where you literally sit down as one of the things that we do is we actually craft out our words. Yep. And I've always been a person, and it goes back to my broadcasting days, I script everything I say. Yep. Because that then helps me to know I'm not going to
miscommunicate, or I'm not going to say something I can't honor. I can't. It's it's not true, or it takes away, and then I won't get carried away.
Right.
I won't get on another tangent somewhere. As a pastor, I learned that's why I scripted my sermons and my messages. Why? Because so many times you'll get up there and you'll get off on a tangent and go way off of where you really want to be. So you've got to learn how to.
Can I be super honest with you for a second? When I first started, that frustrated the heck out of me. The fact that every single little meeting, you and I would sit down, we'd talk through the different points, and then we had to make sure that the points were all like in this perfect thing. I was like, oh my gosh, why are we doing this? But it goes to what you said. So I, as the young leader who thought that I had to just off the top of my head be perfect, it frustrated me that now we have to take the time. Why do we got to take the time? But then as I grew, I realized, oh my gosh, that's exactly what you do to make sure that you are communicating the right way to your people. That intentionality is what I'm going for.
Yeah, absolutely, because words matter.
Right.
And there's power in your words. And so, that's important, especially when it's official communication or it's communication for action or, so that's very important. So, when you look at application of these kinds of ideas, these are things that, of course, I've been practicing for a lot in every different context that I have. Every meeting I walk into, I'm going to have those, talking points ready to go. There's normally going to be a mission, or an idea that we're trying to accomplish. It was something that I caught on early with people who were mentors in my life and all that. But what is the application point for you in how you navigate this?
Yeah. Give yourself enough time. That's the biggest advice that I can give to young leaders, or I say young leaders, I'm only 28, so it's kind of like leaders 2 years younger than me, is give yourself enough time. You don't have to live under the tyranny of time. You don't have to. You can give yourself enough time to write the email right, to create the right kind of speech, to just think through what you're going to say. If you give yourself 20 minutes, if you give yourself 30 minutes, and here's what's crazy. In psychology, what they found is that people drastically underestimate how much time they think they need to do whatever the task is. And so often we go in there being like, an email, I only need like 30 seconds. And so they allocate 10 minutes to answer their emails, and then they never get their emails done.
Right.
Give yourself more time than you think to do it the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned emails, and we do that. We actually are intentional in every response that we make. Why? Because we want to be clear. We want to make sure that we understand what their, the element of that email, and what will also be encouraging and empowering to them. Yep. Because all communication really is to create change, to create growth, to create health. Those kinds of things are so important. So it does come down to intentionality in every aspect of communicating.
So another point, we're in the fire round. What's another application point you got for us?
Well, positive, as I said, you want to empower. So positive affirmation is extremely important to me in communication, because this is going to build up your team. This is going to build up an individual. This is going to strengthen the bonds of relationship. It's going to strengthen future communication. It's going to strengthen your trust between the people that you have the privilege to serve and interact with. But there must be intentionality. And I think also it's different environments of communication. So for me, it's important, and we do this a lot because we travel together. So we are in a variety of communication contexts. But what's important is that you may have your formal time of communication, you may have your guiding time of communication, you may have your dreaming kind of communication, and then what I think is important is your relational, what I would call just any kind fun communication, if you will, to really, again, get to know context, get to know the person, get to know the environment. And so I just would want to ask you here before we close, what is your favorite way to communicate in a practical sense that does these things?
Yeah. Yeah. My favorite communication context. Honestly, I love I say I love the one-on-one. All leaders love the one-on-one because there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of things that's taken off. I love what I call the public one-on-one.
Yeah.
So that's the panel discussion. That's the, let's get 10 of us in a room together. 2 of us are talking, but the rest of us are listening in. It's kind of what we're doing here with this podcast. Right. It's the public one-on-one because what that means is it adds a little more pressure, adds a little more focus, and it makes you have to be more intentional with what you're saying. When you're in a private one-on-one, you can get away with saying so much stuff that maybe you didn't mean or you didn't think through, but the public one-on-one is where you get both the value of one-on-one communication and the benefit of the intentionality as well. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, Well, Dr. Steiner, I want to thank you for joining me today on the Framework Leadership Podcast. I'm thankful for your insight and your communication and the way that you approach, because that's so important in the kinds of things that we do here at Southeastern, kinds of things that we are leading. Your educational expertise is a great strength to me as well as to the university. We're in the midst of what I would call a significant systems reorganization for our community to help us. We've had rapid growth. As you know, if we don't develop systems along with that growth, we can have start to have a declining environment, a declining health. So you have to constantly, and so your voice is significant in leading us and guiding us to make sure that our systems are on point to produce healthy communication. For all of our listeners, I hope that you leave this conversation with a better understanding of how to be a good communicator, an effective communicator, and a communicator that's going to win in every encounter and conversation that you have. Hey, we will see you next time on Framework Leadership.